Hi, I'm Vivian Broughton. I'm a psychotherapist and I specialize in working with psychological and emotional trauma. This is a series of 3 videos that I'm doing based on a little book that I wrote that you can see the image of here, called Becoming Your True Self, a handbook for the journey from trauma to healthy autonomy. The book is small and I wrote it really for clients of mine, but it's become quite popular. So I decided that I would do an online video, and then I decided it would be 3 videos so that it wasn't too overwhelming each time. There's 3 presentations. The first one is talking about trauma, which is this presentation. The second one is looking at beginnings of life, our beginnings, and the third one is looking at healing of trauma or resolving trauma. So this is the first one, and I'm going to launch right into this now. Talking about trauma. So the first thing I want to look at, what does it mean when I say the book title is Becoming Your True Self? What do we mean by our true self? And the first thing I would say about it is our true self is the state of being whole, of being integrated and not psychologically split. And the problem with this is that trauma is the thing that causes our psyche to split. And then we are not whole and we're not truly who we are because some part of ourselves and quite a bit of energy of ourself is split off and is not available to us. So we are functioning then in a split state. And this is what we're going to look at in some detail in this video. So just again as a start, to have a look at what our true, we call it a healthy I, is. Now these are all things that you probably know, would understand and would agree to what it means to be healthy, psychologically and emotionally healthy. Things like being autonomous, being the author of my life and in charge of what's happening in my life, clear thinking, being self-responsible, feeling confident and comfortable, capable of reflection about myself, capable of genuine empathy, able to make good contact with other people, capable of good, healthy relationships. These are all things that we would probably agree are qualities of being in one's healthy self. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can of course pause the video and I will put a PDF of the video on my website so that you can download that if you want. So that gives us an idea of what I'm talking about when I'm saying what is my true self or my true I. So then a question comes for me is, why do we need to talk about trauma? Well, one reason is because there's much confusion about what trauma is and what to do about it. Like the word abuse, the word trauma is kind of used quite freely without a clear definition of what we're talking about. And in a way that diminishes what the true meaning of trauma is. So I think there's a lot of confusion about it, what it is, and there's also, I think, a lot of confusion about how to work with it or how to resolve it. Another reason is because many of us are carrying unresolved trauma without knowing it, and if we are, it influences every moment of our life. So I know from my practice, I have a very busy practice and I teach as well, that no one who comes through my door has not experienced trauma in some way. And as we look in more detail at what I'm talking about when I'm talking about trauma, you will probably start to understand that better. Also, it's because if we have experienced a severe threat at some point in our life, what I would call a trauma, it caused our psyche to split as a life-saving strategy. That is how we survived it. But then what that means is that we are no longer whole and integrated in ourself. We are split. We are divided in ourself. And another thing is, if we don't talk about trauma, our unresolved trauma will end up controlling us and limiting our lives, becoming a source of frustration, dissatisfaction, and disappointment. These are the signifiers, if you like, that there may be unresolved trauma in oneself. And if we don't talk about it, we can't do anything about it. And it may, unresolved trauma within us, it may prevent us from succeeding in life, in our work, in our partnerships, propelling us into a repeating cycle of failed relationships, loneliness, and unhappiness. It's hard for me to really say just how much I think that unresolved trauma underlies pretty much all of our life day-to-day difficulties. And one of the things that I'm hoping to show in these 3 videos is why I think that. So that's my aim. And trauma may even cause us to hurt ourselves through addiction, self-harming practices, obsessions, depressions, schizophrenia, psychosis, and even the ultimate destructive survival strategy, considering suicide as a solution. And what I mean by as a solution in this moment, I mean as a way of avoiding the deep inner pain that tends to surface in us from time to time. What I could call despair, deep feelings of sorrow, disappointment, etc. And some of these, all of these things that I mention here are ways in which we try to distract ourselves or dull the pain, the emotional pain within. And an interesting question then comes is, why do we avoid talking about trauma? Because we have avoided talking about trauma for a very long time. So one of the things, I wrote a book called The Heart of Things about 4 or 5 years ago. And in that book, I did some research to try and understand why it was that when I trained as a psychotherapist in the late 1980s at a very reputable psychotherapy training institute in London, the word trauma was never used. And I got very interested in why this was. And what I learned was that the beginning of the whole psychotherapeutic endeavor in the mid-19th century, when Freud was a student along with many other people in Paris, they actually got together to study trauma. It was called at the time hysteria, which was a diagnosis from Greek times. But basically they were studying trauma. And that was the start of the psychotherapeutic endeavor. And then somewhere it got lost. It resurfaced in the First World War as shell shock, Second World War, and so on. And then after the Second World War, the Vietnam War, it resurfaced again. And in fact, it was the Vietnam War that prompted the resurgence of the study of trauma. There's a couple of very excellent books by a man called Jonathan Shea, an American, who was working with the veterans coming back from Vietnam, and he wrote a couple of books based on the Oedipal stories of the homecoming and making parallels between what happens in Oedipus's homecoming and what was happening with the veterans that he was working with. Also, another leading person who talks about trauma is Bessel van der Kolk, and he also started off by working with Vietnam veterans, and he has devoted a lot of his time to trying to understand trauma. Nevertheless, it has got lost, and as I say, it wasn't mentioned when I trained as a psychotherapist. And the other interesting fact is that the main Western manual of diagnosis of psychological and emotional and mental disorders, if you like, only brought in a category that had the word trauma in the title in 1979. That was post-traumatic stress disorder, which is the common one we tend to think of. But in my view, 2 things. One is, in the current day DSM, the manual, that's what the manual's called, DSM-5, it's still the only category that has the word trauma in it, whereas I would say that pretty much all of the diagnoses in the DSM-4 have trauma as their basic underlying cause. So And the other thing I think is that the post-traumatic stress disorder categorization is entirely inadequate for what I'm going to talk about trauma. So I'm going to just put all of that on one side. But the question, why do we avoid talking about trauma? The answer is because our instinctive nature and the whole splitting process is a way of avoiding the unpleasant and frightening experiences associated with trauma. And it's instinctive in us. In fact, it comes from the reptilian brain, which is like a reaction that we have no control over, so that we avoid the distressing experience. And in a way, I think that's why we have avoided talking about trauma properly and really taking it on. It's only really, I would say, in the psychotherapeutic world, as far as I'm aware, and I'm a little on the edges of it now, it's only really in the last 25 years, 20 years I'd say, that we've started talking about trauma more and making it more central. Whereas I have to say, as a psychotherapist, I think if we don't have the topic of trauma central in our thinking as psychotherapists, we're really missing something extremely important. So, to carry on, I'm moving towards a clear definition of what trauma is. So the first statement that I would make is trauma causes the psyche to split through the process of dissociation and fragmentation, which then impairs our ability to clearly perceive reality and to know who I am. So two of these things, it confuses our perception of the world. We develop biases, if you like, prejudices in our perception of the world. As part of the split off process. We put things out of our consciousness because they are uncomfortable. And so we don't really see reality clearly as it is. And it's also true then that we cannot see ourselves truly for who we are because some part of ourselves is missing. So we're going to move now to a definition of trauma. And I'm going to put it in bullet points just to make it absolutely as clear as I can. Trauma is a situation in which the forces at play are overwhelming. So the first hot word here, I would say, is overwhelming. In a situation that becomes traumatic to me, I am overwhelmed by what's going on. And then the next one, the hot word is helpless. I'm helpless. If I'm overwhelmed, I'm utterly helpless. The third hot point here is that in that moment of utter extreme helplessness, the person fears that they actually will die, that their life is about to end. It's that severe. And the strategies that we have for dealing with high stress, strategies that are commonly called fight or flight, actually fail. They are insufficient. And you can see this if we're helpless, then we cannot fight or flee. So the two don't go together. If we can fight or flee, we're not helpless. So this is a big distinction that I'm going to go into more deeply between high stress and trauma. And the final one is our survival depends on us splitting off the experience because it's too much, it's unbearable experience. And this psychological splitting remains in place. So I'm going to just look here, a little drawing that I did, because I think it's important to understand the difference between high stress and trauma. So we have here, if I can get my cursor, yes, this is a stress level. Down here would be relaxed, rest, no stress, and this is a high stress level, and this is time, a time bar. So this is a curve of increasing stress. Now, to live in the world, to do anything in the world is in fact, we could say, is a stress on the body. We have to produce hormones and chemicals to energize ourselves to do anything. So for me to do this presentation, there's a stress to that. I'm probably in this moment somewhere around here. It's a mild stress for me to do this. But if the situation is more challenging, and the stress level increases, we get to this fight-flight place. So this becomes like a situation, for example, where we're in a dangerous place, dangerous part of the city, and there's people ganging up on us or something like this. There's a fear that we're going to be attacked. We go into fight-flight mode. And what that is the mode of saying, can I fight this? Can I actually combat this situation? Or is it better that I run away? Now, both fight and flight, both of those actions take a lot of energy. So this is a very highly mobilized state. And what that means is the heart's going, the breathing's going, there's all sorts of high energy hormones being released into the body to enable us to perform these high energy actions like fight or flight. Now the point is, this is a very high stress point where we're starting to feel like my life is under threat. And then we reach a tipping point here. Now this tipping point is the point at which somewhere in us we realize we cannot fight and we cannot flee, and we then are into the trauma. And we drop down into this. Now this is a very hypomobilized state. It's almost like the animal that plays dead and flops and goes really limp. Someone, I think Babette Rothschild, called it tonic immobility. The body goes into immobility. And the survival strategies down here are freezing, which is like a rabbit in the headlights, that kind of shock response, and fragmentation, which is what I'm talking about, the splitting. So you'll notice that in the high stress situation, we can fight or flee. We can't do both at the same time. That doesn't make sense. But in the trauma situation, there are two elements to it. There's a freezing, and then there's this fragmentation. So just to recap, reaction to high stress is fight or flight, and it's a very mobilized state. And the reaction to trauma is freeze and fragment, and it's a very low energy state. And in fact, I think about what happens in that moment is that all this energy that's gone to the limbs to enable me to fight or to run away actually goes back to the center of the body because of the life threat to take care of the vital organs, the heart, the lungs, the liver, the kidneys, the vital organs inside that are vital to life. We can't do without those. So that's a basic, I'm just repeating it here just for clarity. Just for clarity again, we can regain our equilibrium from a high stress situation, but we cannot. We're in a new territory. We're in an alien environment. We have shifted from a world, if you like, that's familiar and that's known into a world that is alien and unknown after the trauma. Once psychological splitting has occurred, it remains in place. Now, of course, if I say it remains in place, what I mean by that is we don't naturally recover. We can't recover in a way in that we can continue functioning in the world, but we cannot recover that which has been split off without outside help. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the third video. So how we survive trauma. Our instinctive and natural reaction to the experience of trauma is to avoid it by, first instance, going into a state of shock. This comes from the reptilian brain, the oldest part of our brain at the top of the spinal cord, underneath the neocortex, which is the newest part, and the limbic brain, which is kind of seated in the middle. So we go into a state of shock, like this, and then we dissociate, and that's like, you'll all know what I mean by dissociated state, a slightly sort of spacey experience, a little bit stepped back from the reality of what's going on, and from there our psyche then imposes a structural split. So the dissociation is a process from which we then split off the experience, the intolerable feelings. And from that point on, in a way, we are living a life of continual control, avoidance, and denial. These are the ways, that strategies that we develop, not fully consciously, a lot of it's unconscious, as a way of denying the reality of how bad it was. So here we have, this is our kind of iconic image of the split structure after trauma. So the first thing to say is that before trauma, this whole circle, if you like, we could say that is me. This was all healthy I. And then this is a picture of us after trauma, where we have now this barrier and the split off traumatized I, the traumatized part of myself. And we have this new part that comes into being, what we call the survival I. Now, the only function of this survival I is to hold this split. So in the first instance, when we are faced with the trauma situation, this part saves our life by splitting this off and allowing this part to still exist. On a day-to-day level, this is also true. If it were not for this part, the healthy I would be flooded by these trauma feelings and we would not be able to function. It would be a kind of psychosis. So this part performs an important function to allow us to continue to exist and to function in the world in a reasonably healthy state. The problem is that things come in from the outside and re-stimulate this, and this can lose its current healthiness, and this one has to get busy trying to reclaim the boundaries on this. And we're going to look at this a lot more as we go on. So first of all, I'm going to look at the qualities of the healthy I. In a way, we already looked at this right at the beginning when I was looking at what it means to be one's true self. And I'm not going to go through all of this, but you can, of course, pause the video and you can download the PDF from my website. But it's all the same things: capable of being self-responsible, seeks clarity and truth, has basic confidence, can make good contact, is open to reality. These are all things that I think that you already know. You could probably list many of the qualities of being in your healthy I. What's more important in a way at the moment, I think, is to look at the qualities of the traumatized I. So the function of the traumatized I is, the first one is it stores the memory of the trauma. So it's holding that memory unconscious in its extreme form, unconscious, even if it's an event that we can remember that happened, since a time when we have a memory, like from about 3 years old on. The really unbearable experience of the trauma is what's split off. It stores the emotions and experiences of the trauma. It's always the same age as when the trauma occurred. It's as if that part of ourselves got frozen in time. So we could also say that any time that something happens and you feel very young and very vulnerable, your trauma has been re-triggered. And so the traumatized I is often very young. Is continually engaged with the traumatic experience as if that part is still living in that moment, and it can unpredictably and suddenly be re-triggered in the here and now by things that happen in the moment. So the qualities of the survival I. The first thing to understand is it's not who we really are. This is the whole point. Its only real function is to construct and guard the split. And it does this by various strategies, like denying that the trauma experience was that bad. It wasn't really bad. I managed it. Suppressing the trauma experience, developing behavior that avoids situations that might re-trigger the trauma and avoids personal contact with other people that might re-trigger the trauma. A lot of these processes are unconscious or only semi-conscious. Develops controlling behavior, so controlling of myself so that I don't go to that very disturbing place, but also controlling the behavior of others so that they don't do anything that might re-trigger me. develop compensating behavior, because if we think that a lot of the survival of trauma has required us to suppress our emotions, we can't suppress some emotions without suppressing others, which means that our ability to experience, for example, joy and happiness, love even, may be compromised. And so we may develop compensating behaviors to try and feel some sense of happiness or joy, the most common ones of which are drugs and alcohol. The survival eye fosters illusions such as my childhood wasn't so bad, or the trauma wasn't so serious, or I wasn't really hurt, or that person didn't mean to hurt me. These kinds of ideas to try and diminish the seriousness of the trauma. So if something happens later in my life for which the survival strategies that I've developed up until that time are insufficient, the survival self will cause us to split again and produce new splits. So we may actually have several splits within us if we have experienced several traumas. Or even, of course, the situation that is the case for some people of living as a child in a continually traumatizing environment. And it's a very specific situation, what we would call a traumatized family system that's traumatized in itself and is continually traumatizing. It's a kind of very severe situation I will talk about later. I'm going to look now at some basic categories of trauma. Of course, there's natural events like volcanoes or natural things that happen that cause us distress. In a way, we can usually manage those better because there's often other people who are similarly affected. We're often part of a community that are in the same situation. Also, natural traumas more often don't involve deep, uncomfortable feelings of shame and guilt and things like that, which are more to do with relational traumas. So I'm not going to talk any more about natural events because I think those are relatively easy for us to deal with. If they're not easy for us to deal with, in my view, that is due to our already internal vulnerability because of relational traumas we have experienced. So for me, relational traumas are the ones we really have to look at, and however seriously or not I have been traumatized in that category, then directly influences my ability to deal with a natural event. It's kind of logical in a way. So we're going to look more at relational traumas, and what I mean by relational traumas is a trauma that is perpetrated by one person on another, or by a group of people on another group of people. I would add there that what I'm talking about is same species trauma. So the interesting difference between the human species and many animal species is that most animal species have rituals and ways of dealing with conflict, for example, that avoid traumatizing each other. So a lot of animals have submissive behaviors that they go into in the face of of another member of their species that's stronger and more powerful. And we do something different. And so I'm going to look at relational trauma within our species, the human species. So the first thing to understand about relational trauma, how severe my experience as a traumatized person is influenced by two different things. One of which is intention, whether what is perpetrated against me I perceive as intentional or unintentional. For example, an accident I could perceive as not intentional, and therefore we could say perhaps is not as impactful on me as one that I perceive as someone actually intending to hurt me. That's a different category. And the second one here is relationship, whether the person perpetrating something against me is a stranger or someone I know. And in fact, we could say that the closer the relationship, the more devastating and shocking the effect is likely to be. And of course, then we're moving into the closest relationship, where I'm likely to feel the most devastated is by if I experience a trauma at the hands of, for example, my mother, my father, a sibling, my partner, or my child. So relationship is an important one here. So now we're going to chunk down a little further and look at different types of trauma. The first one is we'd call existential trauma. This is a straightforward, if you like, threat on my life. This can be accidents, attacks, assault, rape, torture, operations. Physical operation can be traumatic, and birth trauma. That also can be an existential trauma. So an existential trauma, in a way, is quite simple. I fear that I may not survive this. My life is under threat. And in a sense, it's quite simple. It's still a trauma, so we can't forget that. But in a sense, it's quite clear and simple. The following ones are not so clear. And the following ones are all traumas that happen when we're very young. Now, the thing that's important to know here is that if we have experienced trauma when we're very young, these traumas that I'm going to talk about next, any trauma that we experience later, like, for example, an accident or an assault or something like that, in that moment of that trauma, these early traumas are also going to be there. So we're now going to look at these, the first of which is the trauma of identity, what we call the trauma of identity. And basically the trauma of identity is a trauma whereby I have to give up on my identity. And the most common reason that I have to give up on my identity is because I was not wanted by my mother. Now, this is a huge topic. This trauma usually happens very early. In my view, it's quite likely to happen in the moment when the mother discovers she's pregnant. And the question for the child, it's an unspoken question because, of course, the child at that point has no brain to ask a question, has no words, nothing. But the experience of the child is about, am I wanted by this mother? So if I feel uncertain about that, and some people do, if I say to people who come through my door at some point, do you think that your mother wanted to have you? It's not uncommon for someone to say, well, she didn't really want another child, she had enough children, or something like this. And of course, you know, this is an intellectual rationale of the situation. The question is, what was the impact on the child at that vulnerable moment of our life? And we're going to look in quite a bit more detail at this. The next trauma that we have that goes with the trauma of identity is what we call the trauma of love. This is also very early, where the child is not able to establish a loving connection with the mother. And of course, if we think about it, if I'm not wanted, then how can I establish a loving connection with my mother? And again, people come through my door and say, well, my mother loved me in her way, or I don't think my mother did love me. And so often people really know this already. The next one I have is a trauma of safety, or I would say the trauma of not being protected. In some ways we call it trauma of sexuality, because the sensual sexual element of confused parents can be very confusing for the child. But essentially what happens is the child is not sufficiently protected by the mother from potential for violence and or sexual exploitation within the family or from outside. And then the final one is the trauma of becoming a perpetrator. Now this is older, so these in a way go in sequential order. The trauma of becoming a perpetrator. Becoming a perpetrator is a survival strategy, a way of not feeling my pain. I make someone else feel it instead. But becoming a perpetrator myself, causing harm to another, is in itself a trauma to me. So these are the types of trauma that we're going to look at in quite a bit more detail. And they come together to make what we call a trauma biography. So we think of our lives as my biography. I was born in the UK, I grew up in this place, in this house, I went to such and such a school, I went to college, I went to university, I then became... We think of this as our biography. My parents were, whatever it is. But there's another biography underneath. This is what we're talking about, and we call it the trauma biography, which is the biography of these various traumas, if we have experienced them, and how we live from them every moment of our life. So we could say that the biography that we know, the one where I say the things that where I lived and who my parents were and what I did, that we live from that, but we also live from this trauma biography, which is underneath. So there's some things I'd like to finish up this lecture with. If we are carrying unresolved trauma, we are living through our trauma biography, as we've just looked at. And in a way, we could say it's not really living, because we're not really fully ourselves. It's not really who we are. We are, in fact, much, much more than that. And I want to make clear here that there is a way out of this. Otherwise, you know, one of the reasons I think, in fact, that we haven't talked about trauma, that trauma has become the big avoided topic in the psychotherapy world and generally through the First World War, the Second World War, the Vietnam War, etc. One of the reasons I think we haven't talked about trauma is because we have not really been able to find a way to deal with it. I think there are lots of survival ways of dealing with it, but what we have found more difficult is to find a way to actually resolve it, rather than to continue to deny it or to strengthen those boundaries, but to actually change it. And I think we can do that. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the final video of this 3, is how we can exit our trauma biography. So to finish for now, I would say this is the start of a journey. If you have watched this video, this is a start of your journey. And this presentation is intended to provide you with a handbook beginning for your journey from a trauma-dominated life to a life where you can fulfill your potential, be who you really are, and form enduring, loving and healthy relationships with others. So we could say, like the little cartoon there, you're here and we're going on a journey. I am inviting you on a journey. And remember, I want you to remember, this is something I found on the internet. I don't know who wrote it, but it absolutely speaks to me. Healing trauma doesn't mean the damage never existed. To say that we can go to a place as if the damage never existed is not true. It is part of our biography, part of who we are, is the trauma that we may be carrying. But at the same time, what we can say is that that healing means the damage doesn't control your life any longer. And I think these are the important things to understand about what we can say about healing trauma. So obviously there's something a little bit more. I think healing trauma means that we must ask the following questions. Who am I really? And the second question is, what do I want? I have this idea that in our life, we have a short lifespan. There's therapy. Yes, of course, you can go into therapy. And most people go into therapy because they're troubled. Things aren't going right in their life. But I think there's something else about life. And that is finding out who I really am. I think that the great philosophers from the past knew this. There was the temple at Delphi, and the thing that said over the temple at Delphi was, know thyself. And I think our life is a journey to finding out who I really am. We do other things along the way. We grow up, we become parents, we have children, we have a career, we do all sorts of jobs, we do lots of exciting things in our life. But in the end, I think the most important thing is to come into contact with myself, to know who I really am. I think I'm better for other people, I'm better for my children if I really know who I am. If I look at the split off parts of me, if I really look deeply in myself and find out who I am and what do I want out of life. These are very, very meaningful questions. So the next presentation I'm going to look at is the beginnings of life, because that's where most of those traumas happen that we were looking at before. So the beginnings of life is part 2. And in the meantime, I just show you, this is the book. You can buy it at any online bookshop you want. It's also been translated into Dutch, German, and we've just got the Russian version, which is very exciting for me. I can't read any of it because the script is even completely different. And down here, you can see this is my website and this is my email address, and you can leave comments here and I'll do my best to answer them. And I look forward to seeing you for the next presentation. So bye for the moment.